Hi, it's Todd, and this video is going to be about one of the ways the big, beautiful bill is going to be devastating to the United States economy. Now, this is going to be particularly for people in the rural areas. Now, before I get into it, I need to set the stage. I need to provide you with some background information. Now, all the communities I will be talking about in this video is going to be white communities. They're not going to be black communities. They're not going to be Latino communities. They're not going to be Asian communities. They're going to all be white communities. And all the people I'm going to be talking about within this video, all the people I've met throughout the United States are all going to be white, not black, not Hispanic, and also not Asian. Now, it has been noted that about 60% of America is poor. And many do not realize that a large percentage of these poor are not just dirt poor, but way below dirt poor. I mean, bedrock, clay poor. Now, I have lived in many parts of the United States, from the West Coast to the East Coast, all the way down to the South. I lived in Texas, California, Chicago, North Carolina, and all the way up to Seattle. I have driven all over the United States. Like I said, from Chicago to Seattle, from Seattle down to LA, from Texas to LA, from North Carolina to Chicago. I've been all over Tennessee, Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas. And once you get off the main highway and go through some of these small towns, you'll see just how poor America really is. I mean, really poor. So let me provide you with a few examples. I had a friend who worked for one of the prisons down in Florida. She told me that people will commit crimes over and over again just to come back to prison. Because in prison, they know they'll get at least 3 meals a day and a warm place to sleep. When I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, I met a guy who lived on a construction site. And he was from the hills of North Carolina. And he was white. And he had a wife and a child who was still up in the hills of North Carolina. But he came down out of the hills to get a job. He was like in his late 20s or early 30s. He told me that he came to North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, because there were no jobs up in the hills of North Carolina. And he has to find some kind of way to support his wife and child. So he came down to North Carolina, and to Charlotte, North Carolina, and the first job he was able to get was cleaning up a construction site. But he was still not making enough money to where he could afford his own apartment, so he just had to live in a tent on a construction site. And even if he wasn't sending money up back home to help support his wife and child, he still would not be earning enough money to afford his own apartment. Now, when I lived in Phoenix, Arizona, I met another man. And he hitchhiked in the wintertime the 2,000 miles from Oregon all the way down to Phoenix, just so he can find work or get employment. Now, when he was in Oregon, he worked one job, the only job he was able to get, and that was going out in the woods and picking wild mushrooms. And from picking wild mushrooms for 2 years, he was finally able to save up $1,000. And when he did that, he hitchhiked from Oregon all the way down to Phoenix in the middle of winter. And the first job he was able to get was working at McDonald's. And he was 28 years old. So for his whole life, he never had a real job until he came to Phoenix, Arizona. And the first job he had in his whole life was working at McDonald's. Now, he also told me that growing up in Oregon, they did have indoor plumbing, but they didn't have any hot water. So he grew up taking cold showers. And what he also told me was that this is the way it was for most people who live within that area. I met another woman who lives out in the bayou or the countryside of Louisiana. And just like my friend who came from Oregon, and a buddy of mine, or another guy I met who came from New Mexico, and the guy I met from the hills of North Carolina, like she was saying, that most people do not have cars within these areas. So they hitchhike, or they have to, share a ride, or find someone who has a car, which is pretty difficult to do. And plus, there is no public transportation within these areas. No buses, no bus stops, no trains, nothing. So getting to the grocery store can be kind of difficult. My point I'm trying to make is, in a lot of these rural areas, there is no industry whatsoever. No industry means no jobs. No jobs mean no employment. And you'll find that in a lot of these rural areas, especially the white part, or the white rural areas, with the white communities, that whole towns, and sometimes almost whole counties are receiving food stamps, or are receiving food stamps and also on Medicaid. In fact, some states like, I think, Arkansas and Louisiana and Missouri, I think about half the state is receiving Medicaid. And if you're receiving Medicaid, it means you qualify for food stamps, which means that if they're receiving Medicaid, they're receiving food stamps. So half of these people within these states, except Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana, are receiving food stamps. And when the big, beautiful bill requirements kick in 2026, it's going to be devastating to most of these communities. Because one of the requirements within the big, beautiful bill is you have to have employment, you have to be working. And if these communities, all over the United States, from, like I said, Oregon, Washington, Iowa, Florida, New Mexico, even the southern parts of Illinois, there is no industry, there is no jobs. So if there's no industry and there's no jobs, how are they going to get employment to fulfill that requirement? Well, the other requirement is that if you can't find employment, you can also volunteer. What the problem with volunteering is, you have to pay the rent for the buildings, you have to hire the staff, and then the staff can then go out and find volunteers. And if people have the education and the skills to be able to set up a volunteer network like domestic violence shelters, suicide prevention hotlines. A lot of them do not live in those rural areas. They live in the cities and they commute over. Well, not really commute, but they come in within those areas. Now, if you're in those areas, how are you going to get to those offices? There is no public transportation. Plus, the big, beautiful bill cuts a lot of grants for all those programs. So the grants for suicide hotline has been cut. The grants for domestic violence shelters have been cut. A lot of grants relating to helping with people with disabilities have been cut. A lot of grants for helping seniors citizens has been cut. So if all those programs go away, how are these people in these rural areas going to fulfill the requirement of volunteering? Therefore, the people in the rural areas who are on food stamps and want to keep their food stamps pretty much have no way of keeping those food stamps if there's no jobs and there's no way to volunteer. Which means that this is going to be completely devastating to large portions or large parts of America. Then let's look at the agricultural worker. In Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, even Illinois, a lot of farms have lost their overseas customers. No one is buying our rice, soybeans, or wheat overseas any longer. Business is now going to Brazil and Argentina and other South American countries. Because of that, a lot of smaller and mid-sized farms are going out of business or going bankrupt, which means that a lot of those workers are now unemployed and those farmers are unemployed. Therefore, they won't be able to get any food stamps because they're not working. Then let's look at all of the businesses that support agriculture and agricultural workers, restaurants, grocery stores, and apartment complex. If people are not working, they can't buy groceries, hard for them to pay the rent, which means grocery store chains that rely heavily on the money they receive from food stamps, they're going to go out of business, which means that it's going to create a lot more job loss within those areas. Look at the trucking industry. Take the wheat and the corn and the rice and the soybeans and they move it across the country or move it to the shipyards to be shipped overseas. They have no more business, which means that a lot of those trucking companies, and a lot of them are, going out of business. There's one in Alabama who just filed bankruptcy and they have 1,000 employees. And now that trucking company is out of business, which means 1,000 employees within Alabama have lost their jobs. So what I'm saying is, when you look at food stamps, it's not just going to be confined to just a local area. It's going to spread out like a snowball, like a downward spiral. It's going to affect almost every industry within the United States and create more and more job loss, especially within the rural areas, in a lot of different ways. So you might say, food stamps is not that important when we look at the big picture and how it is connected to agriculture, government employees, grocery stores, hospitals, because with the food stamps cut also comes the Medicaid cuts. Hospitals can go out of business. All the restaurants that support the workers within the hospitals. It's going to affect trucking and all the restaurants and the hotels and the stores that support the trucking industry and those workers. All the people who load up trucks and unload trucks, the warehouses. It's just going to create a downward spiral, a big ass snowball effect. So you might look at, and say, I'm a MAGA person, and I don't like people who are black and brown, receiving food stamps. But you have to realize, you may not want us to receive it, they may want us to hurt, but in the long run, it's going to be extremely devastating to the white community in the rural areas of the United States. And that's about it. That's all I'm going to say. Don't forget to like and subscribe and comment and all that stuff. I have no subscribers. I mean, absolutely no subscribers. So at least press that subscribe button. Thank you.